Hey everybody, it's a new video from another majestic INFJ. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, welcome back. If you've seen a couple of videos. What I want to do with this video, this is just going to be one of my riff videos. So take it for what it's worth. Hopefully you get something out of it. And I want to just sort of riff on the topic of the rarity of the INFJ. That seems to be an issue that pops up pretty frequently around the community. And I was just watching a video from, let me make sure I get his name right, AstroBoyRicardo. I'll put a link to his video below. But, and he's talking about the fact that INFJs are sort of notably rare in the general population. But his video actually goes on to talk about how a lot of people who might test as INFJs might not actually be INFJs. And so I guess if that were true, and it might be, that would actually make INFJs even rarer, right? Because if you have a lot of people who are, or more rare, if you have a lot of people who are coming out as INFJs and there's still a low percentage of the population, and you have a lot of those people who test as INFJs but aren't, then that would make the percentage of people who actually are INFJs, lower than what the stats show. And unless there's just some sort of issue with the test where you have a lot of people testing as positive for INFJ who aren't INFJ, and then people who are testing as another type that should be testing as INFJ. So if that were the case, the data would just sort of wash out. But anyways, don't want to digress there. But I thought, it actually got me thinking here about, are INFJs actually all that rare? And we see all of the the articles and the blog posts and stuff talking about how INFJ is the rarest type, and it's something like 1.5% of the population. And this has been around, I think, ever since the Myers-Briggs book, the Gifts Differing book. I think they had some stats in that book, and it's from the 50s, 60s, somewhere around there. But they had some stats in that book, and it showed INFJs being very rare. And I was thinking, well, maybe the stats are just old and things have changed since then. And so I dug up this article. It's on Personality Max. I have no idea how valid of a source that is, but it came up on the Google search. But they cite to a study, and this looks like a relatively recent article. I can't really tell where, when it was published, but, it looks like within the last few years probably, at least more recently than the 50s. So let's just put it that way. So they actually cite a study that another institution did, the 16 Personalities Foundation, and they're citing their data and how what the personality types break down, the percentage of the population for each personality type. I don't want to waste time or take time, attacking the study or trying to find, holes in the study. I'm just going to take it for what it's worth, right? I mean, every study is going to have some inherent flaws, when you're doing general population statistics like this. So I'm not going to belabor that point. I'm just going to take it at face value, and discuss it based off of that. Okay, so what did they find? And I'll put a link to the article in the comments here. But so what they found was with INFJs represent 1.5% of the population. So, and that is the lowest percentage among the types The next closest would be the ENTJ, which I found kind of surprising, at 1.8%. And so roughly around the same percentage as the INFJ. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. I mean, obviously 1.5% of the overall population seems like a really low number, right? And in the grand scheme of things, it is. But the one thing you have to keep in mind, I'm pulling out my calculator here, is that you only have 16 types, right? And if we were just to, and if all 16 types were equally represented in the population, right? Say the same number of people in each type, so it was an equal percentage of the population, you're still only going to, each type is still only going to be 6.25% of the overall population, right? So if, all of the INTJs and all the INFJs and all the ISTJs were the same percentage of the overall population, then all of the types would be 6.25 of the overall population, right? So, so it's a pretty low baseline number to start with, right? And so you don't want to be too thrown off by the fact that it's only 1.5% of the population. Now, that being said, 1.5% of the population is a lot different than 6.25%, right? So it's still pretty significantly different than what you would expect the average to be, right? So, I think it's still worth noting that INFJs are rare. And they're a lot rarer than the other types. And so I sort of want to just sort of riff on why that might be, and probably more specifically, why INFJs seem to be overrepresented in the MBTI personality type world. Because there tends to be a lot of backlash because there's a lot of INFJ channels out there. There's a lot of INFJ forums. There's a lot of people posting online that they're INFJs. And so there's this automatic reaction of, well, INFJs are very rare. They're only 1.5% of the population. So we can't have this, many INFJs with YouTube channels and blog posts and whatnot. So there's sort of this assumption that people who are posing as INFJs aren't really INFJs because just mathematically or statistically speaking, you shouldn't have that many INFJs represented in the overall community, right? The personality community. So that tends to be the argument, comes up a lot, has over the past several years. But one thing I would argue, and something to keep in mind, is that the Myers-Briggs, Carl Jung, cognitive functions, personality types, that is just candy to an INFJ, right? I mean, INFJs just eat this kind of stuff up. And in fact, if there's another personality type into this stuff, sometimes I sort of wonder, why are you into this? You're not an INFJ. Because it just seems homegrown and built for an INFJ. And I think there's a pretty good argument that Jung himself was an INFJ, even though I think he self-identified as an INFP or an INTJ, something like that. But we all know he was an INFJ. And so because, INFJs are just naturally attracted to this kind of stuff, you're going to see an overrepresentation of INFJs in the community. So let's sort of unpack that and talk about why that might be. First of all, the personality types, cognitive functions, just trying to figure out what type somebody is and doing some sort of deep analysis of how the cognitive functions work and how they all stack up. That is just fodder for introverted intuition, plus introverted thinking, right? Which the INFJs have, right? You're trying to piece all of these separate pieces of data that you're collecting from different sources, different videos, different blog posts, different articles, different books that you read, and you're trying to synthesize all of that data and all of those observations and descriptions of INFJs and stuff into a discrete package, a universal truth, a representation of what a certain personality type is, right? What is an ENFP? What is an ISTJ? What is an INFJ? We've got all this data and we need to sort of synthesize it into a collective unit or whole to form a representation of what these different things are. Same with the functions. What is introverted thinking? What is extroverted thinking? What is introverted feeling? So on and so forth. And again, you're taking all this data, all these summaries, all these descriptions, all these various ways of describing it that you pick up along the way, and you're synthesizing all of that information into a little packet, a little representation of what you think introverted feeling is, or what you think introverted thinking is. And that is compiling data and forming it into a single truth or a single representation is what introverted intuition is doing, right? And so you could imagine that, an INFJ who has dominant introverted intuition is just going to be naturally attracted to that. And then you tie it to their introverted thinking, which is, logic-based processing, given a certain set of propositions or conditions. Can you come up with a valid argument or a valid classification of things? And introverted thinking through, symbolic logic is creating these representational networks in our head, categorizing things like what makes a dog, what makes a cat, what makes a bird, what types of things are dogs, what types of things are cats. All of that stuff is being built through our logical TI system. Watch my video on that. And when you have all these different sort of types, these different categories, that's just going to set an INFJ's TI, running amok, right? I mean, you'll spend hours just, in the shower or, on the train or in the car, just sort of thinking about, okay, if introverted feeling is this and extroverted feeling is that, then, what components do you have in introverted feeling and how's that going to show up in an ESFP and all that kind of stuff. That's just analytical classification, straight up TI, right? Instead of your TI working overtime, trying to figure all this stuff out, you have your introverted intuition that's taking all those sort of logical classifications out of your TI and trying to pack it together into some representation or some unified whole. And the INFJ brain just loves doing that kind of stuff, right? Okay. And then you add on the extroverted feeling as your tool function. And, one of the things about extroverted feeling is learning how to navigate and work within the social domain, right? And so a large part of that is just reading people and knowing what type of person you're interacting with and what do they like, what do they don't like, and how can you relate to them. And and where are they in the hierarchy, and how can you better understand them? All that kind of stuff, just trying to figure out people and frankly, trying to put them into boxes, right? So that when you're navigating the social world, you sort of know, okay, this is that type of person, and here's how I deal with that type of person, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want it to come across as too mechanical, but it is in a large way. Just sort of classifying people. And so INFJs are, again, going to be drawn to something that is useful, right? Because with an INFJ, their tool function is FE. And the tool function is basically, the function you use the most to sort of get what you want, to accomplish your goals. And so if you have this quote unquote tool, the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs, or the cognitive functions, or Jungian psychological types, whatever you're into, socionics, if you have that kind of framework and that kind of tool that you can use, then again, if you're an INFJ, you're just going to suck it up because you're like, oh, wow, I can use this tool for my tool function. So you add all that together, right? And then on top of that, again, with the FE, people with FE like to be helpful. And INFJs in particular, they like to be helpful by showing people, what they know, and giving them little bits of wisdom, right? The archetypal, wise old man, or the counselor that has these little packets of information that we've built up along the way using our introverted intuition and our introverted thinking. And we just have these little tidbits, these little words of advice. And we like to be helpful through our FE mechanism. And so you're going to see a lot of people making YouTube channels like this, where they just want to talk about what they think, the different personality types are, or what the different cognitive functions are. Because INFJs, we think we're being helpful. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. But at least we think we are, right? And it's that FE part of us that sort of kicks in. And when you're an INFJ, you tend to think you're being helpful by sharing your wisdom with other people, right? Whether they want to hear your advice or not. You're certainly going to share it with them if you're an INFJ. And, so what's better than getting on the online course, the online, message boards and blogs and YouTube channels and stuff, and just getting it all out there and telling people, what you think the different functions are and what they're doing and what the different types are. And what, and how to identify the types, because you're contributing to society and helping people through that way. Okay, so you tie all that stuff together, and so you can see why INFJs would be overrepresented in this field. And I would argue, that it's probably similar in things like horoscopes or astrology or tarot card reading. Not to necessarily compare, personality types with that, but it's sort of the same framework and the same goal when you think of, astrology or tarot cards. You're number one, you're trying to be helpful, right? You're trying to help somebody understand what's going on in their life, or what they should be doing or not doing. And so in some respects, you're giving advice, but the advice you're giving is based off of these very intricate, systems like astrology that gets real complicated real quick, right? When you talk about all the different houses and all the different planets and stars aligning and everything, it's a very, very complicated system that, only somebody with, an overcharged TI is going to be able to follow, or, put any sort of time into trying to figure it out, right? And so you have that overcharged TI that's just, eating up all this astrology, all this tarot card information, all the little rules and all the little combinations and permutations, and trying to figure out some logic to the system. And then you tie that to your woo-woo intuition, right? Where you're trying to, use all that information that's been, that your TI is spitting out, and then combining it into some sort of representative whole, so that when you meet a Leo, you know what a Leo is, right? Because you have some representation that your introverted intuition built, or you know what it means to have a rising Pisces sign, and the types of people who are into that. So again, and then you also tie it to the fact that it allows you to help people and counsel people, right? This real intricate system that does that. So you can see why INFJs probably throughout history have been the shamans, the priests, the oracles, the tarot card readers, the gypsy, fortune tellers, those sorts of people, because it's a very TI, NI system that gets expressed through the FE, right, to the outside world. Okay, so so to the extent that somebody wants to make an argument that so and so is not really an INFJ because INFJs are so rare, so you can't possibly have this many INFJs out there on YouTube or creating blog posts or whatever. I would argue, well, yeah, I get it, but you have to understand INFJs are just going to be overly represented in this kind of stuff, because this is just made for INFJs. Okay. Some other things that I found that were sort of interesting, just sort of riff on the stats that are here in this table. So INFJs are rare. 1.5%. And I guess that seems to be pretty consistent with, how things were back in the 50s. So, there's sort of a question of, well, why are they so rare? And I guess my argument, and I'm going to flesh this out a little bit more when I talk about the SJs, but if there's any sort of genetic component to it, right? So if your parents' genes somehow contribute to your personality type, which is probably the case, right? Because we're talking about the brain and what the brain does. There's going to be some genetic component. And my guess is that, INFJs are probably the product of relatively introverted people. And even if it's largely behavioral as opposed to genetic, INFJs are probably more likely to have, introverted parents or have some sort of introverted surrounding. Not all, obviously, but there was probably a tendency towards it. And introverts, they tend to have fewer children, and so if you have fewer children, then there's less of a chance of producing an INFJ, so on and so forth, right? So let's compare that to the ISTJ, the ISFJ, the ESTJ, and the ESFJ, which I'm going to refer to as the SJs. And they are way overrepresented in the population. So you've got the highest percentage of all the types, according to this data, is 13.8% for the ISFJ, right? And next in line is the ESFJ at 12%, the ISTJ at 11.6%, and the ESTJ at 8.7%. So again, if we think of 6% as being our baseline, right? That if all types were equal, they would each be 6% of the population. Then each of the SJ types is overrepresented, and in some respects way overrepresented, like almost twice as much or more than twice as much. Okay. So then the question would be, okay, well, why, right? And there's probably a few things here. If you think of the genetic component, again, if you're an SJ and you're likely to have a parent who's an SJ or a grandparent who's an SJ, again, assuming there's sort of something genetic going on, SJs might be more likely to have more children, right? I mean, these are sort of the functional people in society. These are the worker bees. These are, basically your bread and butter of society. And they probably tend to be, lean towards the religious side. And people who are religious tend to have more children. So that could be one thing. It's just that SJs just are producing more SJs because they have more children, that kind of thing. And they're, SJs are probably, employed, middle to upper class, working people. And, that obviously helps with, and they tend to have more children, that kind of thing. So there's probably something there. This is just me riffing. I haven't looked at any data that says that, but it's just stuff to think about. And then the other thing is you could just see how just through biological evolution that, there would be sort of an over-representation of the SJ type in society, right? All things being equal, a society or a culture is probably going to be more productive, have a better chance of survival, as a society or as a culture if they have a lot of SJs, right? Because the SJs are the ones out there doing the work, right? The SJs are the ones out there, largely contributing to society and, doing all the, jobs, across the span, right? From lower to middle class all the way up to high end, professionals, doctors, lawyers, all that kind of stuff, business people. And so you're going to see a broad swath of SJs across the society who are going to be very functional. They keep the trains running on time. They make sure that everybody's got enough to eat. They just, they're just sort of the backbone of society. And so you could see why, that they might be overrepresented in the population, right? Because it's probably just good for humans to have as many SJs out there as possible. And you compare that to, us INFJs sitting down there at 1.5%. We make contributions. We're pretty good, but we're not the backbone of society. We're sitting up at the peanut gallery, making little snarky comments, and giving everybody advice, whether or not they want it. That's what the INFJ is doing. We are productive members of society, but not nearly as much as the SJs are. Let's just be honest with ourselves. And then the other interesting thing I saw is the ENTJ is sitting there at 1.8%, and the INTJ is at 2.1%. And so, again, sort of raises the question, why are they so underrepresented here? And, aside from, comments that like you got a bunch of people who are probably ENTJs that aren't testing as ENTJs, that kind of thing. Again, I just want to take the data at its face value here. And so I guess with the ENTJ, again, if there's some sort of genetic component, I could imagine a lot of ENTJs are the types that are just like so career driven and that they don't tend to have a lot of children, if they have children at all. I just sort of think of the ENTJs I know, and whether they're not soft and cuddly kid types, right? If there's a type that's likely to say, look, I don't want kids because they're going to slow me down or they're going to slow my career down, chances are it's an ENTJ, right? And so maybe they're underrepresented because you just don't have, again, if there's some sort of genetic component to this, you just don't have a whole lot of ENTJs having kids. So, and of course, I'm sure somebody knows an ENTJ with 16 kids. I get it, but we're talking on average. And, and then I guess it's hard to argue that they don't really benefit society in the same, in the way that SJs do. I mean, ENTJs are obviously very beneficial, but they tend to be beneficial on their own, right? Like they're not beneficial in the sense of, with SJs, if you get a big collection of SJs, you've got a good running factory, right? Or a good running office, right? All the SJs, all little worker bees are doing their jobs the way they're supposed to be doing it and keeping the trains running on time and keeping everybody fed, right? The ENTJs, when they contribute to society, they're kind of contributing, in this this individualistic kind of way, right? Like they're the focal point, they're the leader. You don't have a whole bunch of ENTJs in the office, right? Because they would all just, compete with each other and all try to, basically be the alpha male or the alpha female of the office, right? Because ENTJs like to run things. So I guess I could see, if evolution sort of shook out that way, it probably doesn't want a whole lot of ENTJs because they're all going to compete with each other, right? And you probably only want one ENTJ in any particular group of people, right? Like one Julius Caesar or one Napoleon. Having multiple Julius Caesars probably, isn't going to function well, right? And so you could imagine, throughout history, if there was an ENTJ popping up, in ancient Rome or Greece or whatever, they might have been seen as a threat by the other ENTJ out there that was running things and taken out, right? Something interesting to think about, right? And it's to me, it's just sort of interesting that the ENTJ is sort of seen as this like apex predator of the personality types, right? Like the Napoleon, the Julius Caesar, the guys or gals that are running the show. And it also sort of shakes out in the population data here, right? That you just don't have that many of them in the population. Now, I don't know what exactly the explanation for that is. It's just sort of interesting to me. Okay, that's probably about it. I might look at this some more and maybe have some other observations. INTP actually came out a little higher than I would have expected. They're at 3.3%. So as far as the NTs go, yeah, INTP and ENTP, are hovering around a little over 3%. So that's a little higher than their INTJ and ENTJ buddies. But, again, I could see why they're overall sort of less represented because the essays just suck up so much oxygen out of this, that all the other types are just bound to be underrepresented. And then I was also interested that the SPs, the ISTP, the ISFP, the ESTP, and the ESFP tend to be a little higher percentage-wise. They're between about 4 and 8%. With ISFP being at 8.8%, which I found pretty interesting because I don't really run across that many ISFPs because they're out designing their clothes or taking their pictures or whatever the ISFPs are doing at the moment. So that's interesting that, you know, they've got a higher percentage than I would have expected. Actually higher than the ESTJ. That's interesting. Okay. Anyways, that's it. I hope this was somewhat helpful. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you next time. Bye.